"It hurts when I sit," she said, barely above a breath, and in the dim barack lit by a single swinging bulb, no one turned, because they all understood, because pain had become something private, something carried in silence. Outside, Mississippi air pressed heavy against the wooden walls, thick as wet cloth, cicadas screaming into the night, and inside, 30 women lay on narrow cots or sat upright without leaning back, as if the act of resting itself had rules they no longer trusted. Anna Weiss kept her hands folded in her lap, shoulders straight, back never touching the wood behind her, because even the smallest shift sent a quiet signal through her body, not sharp, not dramatic, just enough to remind her of everywhere she had been before this place. She said nothing more, and no one asked, because questions implied expectation, and expectation was something they had learned to live without. The next morning came early. 5:30 a.m., the sky already pale with heat rising from the fields, and the women moved in formation, boots on dry earth, posture unchanged, eyes forward, as if discipline could replace comfort. Corporal James Carter stood near the edge of the yard with a clipboard in his hand, watching without appearing to watch, his uniform pressed, sleeves rolled just enough to show forearms browned by the sun, his expression neutral, almost bored, like a man assigned to routine. The report he held was simple, typed clean, no smudges, no urgency, female POWs. Condition stable. No complaints. He read it once, then again, as if the words might shift under closer inspection, but they didn't, they never did. What did shift was something else, something harder to name, something in the way the women lowered themselves onto benches during the midday break, not like people sitting, but like people negotiating with gravity, inch by inch, careful, controlled, avoiding any sudden movement. One of them, younger, maybe 19, paused halfway down, her breath catching just slightly, her jaw tightening for a fraction of a second before she completed the motion, and then it was gone, her face smooth again, her posture straight, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond the fence line. Carter noticed. He didn't write it down, he didn't call it out, he simply watched, the way a man watches a detail that doesn't match the rest of the picture. The sun climbed higher. Heat settling over the yard in layers, 90 degrees, then more, the kind of heat that slowed everything except observation. The women remained quiet, efficient, never leaning back, never relaxing into the wood, as if rest was something that had to be earned or perhaps something that could be taken away. Carter lowered the clipboard slightly, his thumb resting over the printed words, no complaints, and for the first time that day, he looked up fully, not at the group as a whole, but at the small, almost invisible gap between what was written and what was real, a gap measured not in reports or regulations, but in the way a person chooses to sit when no one is watching. The afternoon settled heavier than the morning, heat rising from the ground in slow waves that blurred the edges of everything, turning fences into soft lines and distant trees into shapes that seemed to drift, and still the women moved with the same controlled precision, bending, lifting, placing, never rushing, never hesitating, as if each motion had been measured in advance. Anna Weiss worked near the center row, her hands steady, her breathing even, but every time the bell signaled a short break, she remained standing for a second longer than the others, just enough to let her body prepare, just enough to avoid the sudden drop that would follow if she moved too quickly. When she finally sat, it was slow, deliberate, her weight shifting inch by inch, her eyes fixed forward, her face unchanged, as if nothing at all had happened. Around her, the others did the same, a quiet pattern repeating itself again and again, so consistent it almost disappeared. Corporal James Carter stood beneath the narrow shade of a supply shed, watching with the same stillness, his clipboard now tucked under his arm, unused, forgotten, because the information it held no longer felt complete. He had seen fatigue before, had seen hunger, had seen men and women push through conditions far worse than this, but this was different, not louder, not obvious, just a small, persistent detail that did not belong. He stepped forward once, as if to say something, then stopped, the words dissolving before they reached his mouth, because there was nothing to accuse, nothing to correct, nothing that fit within the language of orders or reports. The bell rang again, signaling the end of the break, and the women stood almost in unison, rising with the same careful control, back straight, movements quiet, and Carter noticed how quickly they returned to standing, how natural that position seemed compared to sitting. Later, as the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the rows, he walked past the benches they had used, running his hand lightly over the rough wood, feeling the hard surface beneath his fingers. Unyielding, unchanged, he paused there for a moment, not long enough to draw attention, just long enough to consider the space between what was provided and what was needed, a space no report had mentioned. That evening, as the women filed back toward the barracks, their silhouettes stretched thin against the fading light, Anna moved with the same quiet rhythm, her steps measured, her posture unchanged, and when she reached the doorway, she hesitated for just a fraction of a second before sitting again inside, the motion slow, careful, almost practiced. Outside, Carter remained where he was, watching the door close, the sound soft against the thick air, and for the first time since he had read the words, "no complaints," he understood that silence was not the same as absence, and that sometimes the most important thing in a place like this was not what was said, but what was never spoken at all. The night held its heat long after the sun disappeared, the air inside the barracks unmoving, thick with the quiet presence of 30 women who had learned to exist without complaint, and somewhere in that stillness, the same careful pattern repeated itself again, bodies lowering slowly, deliberately, never surrendering fully to the wooden benches that lined the walls. Anna Weiss sat near the far end, her hands resting lightly on her knees, her back straight, her breathing controlled, but beneath that control was calculation, a constant awareness of pressure, of weight, of how much could be allowed before the discomfort returned, and she adjusted without thinking, small shifts invisible to anyone not looking for them. Outside, under a sky that had turned deep blue before fading to black, Corporal James Carter walked the perimeter path with no real destination, his steps measured, boots pressing softly into dry ground, the distant hum of insects filling the silence between each thought. He had seen many things that could be written down, things that fit into reports, things that could be explained in clear language, but this was not one of them. This was something quieter, something that existed in the space between observation and understanding. Earlier that evening, he had stood near the supply room, looking at the stacks of canvas materials folded neatly on wooden shelves, items meant for repairs, for temporary use, for things that did not require attention beyond function, and for a moment he had run his hand across one of them, feeling the thickness of the fabric, the way it held shape without being rigid, and he had paused, not because it was important, but because it might be. He did not take anything then, he did not act, because action required certainty, and certainty was something he had not yet earned. Back inside the barracks, the women remained quiet, the only sounds the occasional shift of fabric, the soft creak of wood, the steady rhythm of breathing that filled the space like a shared understanding. Anna closed her eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to measure, to test the balance between stillness and discomfort, and when she opened them again, nothing had changed, not the room, not the air, not the expectations placed upon them. Across the room, another woman adjusted slightly, then stopped, as if even that small movement had crossed a line. No one spoke, no one acknowledged it, the silence held. Outside, Carter stopped near the barracks wall, close enough to hear the faint sounds within, not words, just presence, and he stood there longer than necessary, his hand resting briefly against the wood, feeling the retained heat from the day, the way it lingered even as the night moved forward. He looked down at his hands, then back toward the supply shed in the distance, barely visible in the low light, and something in that quiet alignment of details, the benches, the posture, the unspoken pattern, began to form into something clearer, not yet a decision, but no longer just observation. The kind of understanding that did not arrive all at once, but built slowly, piece by piece, until ignoring it became more difficult than acting on it. Morning came before the air had time to cool, the sky already pale and stretching wide above the flat land, and the camp moved back into rhythm as if the night had only been a brief pause in something continuous, boots on dirt, gates opening, quiet lines forming without instruction, the same order repeated without question. Anna Weiss stepped forward with the others, her posture unchanged, her movements measured, but beneath that calm was the same awareness, the same quiet calculation that followed her into every motion, every pause, every moment of stillness. Across the yard, Corporal James Carter was already there, earlier than usual, standing near the supply shed with no clipboard in his hand this time, no paper to confirm or deny what he had seen, only the memory of it, clearer now than any written report. The shed door stood open behind him, revealing rows of folded canvas, pale in the early light, edges straight, untouched. He had returned there before dawn, when the camp was still, when decisions could be made without interruption, and he had moved through the narrow space slowly, selecting not with urgency, but with care, as if the choice itself required precision. Now, as the women moved past him toward the field, he said nothing, did nothing, only watched, the way he had always watched, but with a difference that could not be seen from the outside. By midday, the heat had risen again, pressing down in steady waves, the benches in the shade offering their usual brief relief, and once more the pattern began, the slow lowering, the controlled descent, the careful balance between rest and discomfort. Anna reached the bench end, paused for that same fraction of a second, her body preparing for what it had already learned to expect, her hands hovering slightly before she placed them down, and then she began to sit. But this time, something interrupted the pattern, something small, almost unnoticeable at first. The surface beneath her was not the same, it gave slightly, just enough to change the motion, just enough to remove the need for hesitation. She stopped halfway, not from pain, but from surprise, her eyes shifting downward for the first time, taking in the plain piece of canvas placed neatly across the wood. Around her, the others noticed it too, one by one, the same pause spreading along the line like a silent signal. No one spoke, no one moved further, the air seemed to hold for a moment, suspended between what had always been and what was now different. At the far end, Carter stepped forward, not toward them, but toward one of the benches, his movement steady, unhurried. He placed his hand on the canvas, then sat down without looking at anyone, his weight settling fully, naturally, as if it had always been there. He remained for a second, then stood again, brushing nothing off, adjusting nothing, and walked away without a word. Behind him, the silence remained, but it had changed. Anna looked at the fabric once more, then lowered herself the rest of the way, slowly, carefully, expecting the same resistance, the same quiet signal her body had memorized. But it did not come. Her shoulders released by a fraction, her breath shifted, not deeper, not louder, just different. She did not look up, she did not react, she simply remained seated, still, balanced in a way that felt unfamiliar, and for the first time since arriving, the act of sitting required no negotiation at all. The moment did not break into voices or movement, it simply settled, quiet and almost invisible, like a shift in air pressure that no one announced but everyone felt. Along the row of benches, the women remained where they were, seated now not with tension but with a strange stillness that came from the absence of something they had carried for too long. Anna Weiss did not move right away, her hands still resting on her knees, her back straight out of habit, not necessity, and her eyes remained forward as if the world had not changed at all, but inside that stillness something had adjusted, something small but undeniable. She tested it without thinking, a slight shift of weight, a subtle lean that would have been impossible before, and when nothing followed, no quiet signal of resistance, no reminder to correct herself, she allowed that position to remain. Around her, the others made similar adjustments, each in their own time, each discovering the same absence, the same unexpected permission to rest without calculation. No one spoke, the silence held, but it was no longer the same silence that had filled the barracks the night before. This one carried something else, something softer, something that did not need to be named. Across the yard, Corporal James Carter moved as he always did, checking the perimeter, speaking briefly with another soldier, his actions unchanged, his expression neutral, but he did not look toward the benches again. Not because he did not care, but because he did not need to confirm what he had already understood. The work resumed after the break, the women rising from the benches, but even that motion had shifted, no longer the careful negotiation of before, no longer the slow descent in reverse, but something simpler, more direct, as if a small part of the effort had been removed. Anna stood without hesitation, her body responding naturally, and for a fraction of a second she paused, not from discomfort, but from the unfamiliar ease of it. The afternoon stretched on, the sun lowering gradually, shadows lengthening across the field, and the rhythm of work continued, steady, quiet, uninterrupted. Yet beneath that rhythm, something had changed that could not be recorded, could not be measured, could not be written into any report. It existed only in the way they moved, the way they sat, the way they no longer avoided a simple act that had once required so much attention. When the final bell sounded and the women returned toward the barracks, the same formation held, the same silence, but Anna walked with a difference so slight it would have gone unnoticed by anyone not looking for it, her steps just a fraction more fluid, her posture still upright but no longer rigid. Inside the barracks, as evening settled once again, the benches waited in the same places, the canvas still laid across them, unchanged. Unremarkable to anyone who did not know what had come before, Anna reached her place and sat without pause, without preparation, without the careful lowering that had defined every previous movement, and for a moment she remained there, completely still, not because she had to be, but because she could be. Outside, the night gathered slowly, and somewhere beyond the walls, Carter walked the same path as before, his steps measured, his presence quiet, leaving behind no explanation, no instruction, no acknowledgement, only a change that spoke for itself in the simplest possible way. The next day did not arrive with ceremony, it simply unfolded the same way all days did, with pale light stretching across the yard and the quiet movement of routine taking hold before anyone had time to question it, and yet something had shifted beneath that sameness, something small enough to escape notice, but steady enough to remain. Anna Weiss stepped out with the others, her posture still straight, her expression unchanged, but her body no longer bracing for something it had learned to expect, no longer preparing for discomfort before it arrived. The benches waited in the same places, the canvas still laid across them, plain and unremarkable, already gathering dust as if they had always been there, as if they were part of the structure itself. When the midday break came, the women moved toward them without hesitation, not faster, not slower, just without the pause that had once defined every movement. Anna sat first this time, not by intention, but by absence of delay, her body lowering in one continuous motion, no adjustment, no calculation, and when she settled, she remained still, her hands resting lightly, her shoulders no longer held in quiet tension. Around her, the others followed, each finding the same ease in their own way, the same quiet realization that nothing needed to be resisted. No one spoke, the silence remained, but it carried a different weight now, no longer guarded, no longer defined by expectation, but by something closer to acceptance. Across the yard, Corporal James Carter stood near the fence line, speaking briefly with another soldier, his tone even, his posture relaxed, and when his gaze passed over the benches, it did not linger, it did not need to, because the change he had set in motion required no supervision, no reinforcement, only time. The afternoon continued, the heat rising and falling in slow waves, the rhythm of work steady and unbroken, but the difference showed itself in ways too subtle to record, in the way the women returned to the benches without hesitation, in the way they rose again without stiffness, in the way their movements no longer carried the same hidden resistance. Anna noticed it most in the quiet moments, the spaces between tasks, when her body did not anticipate discomfort before it arrived, when sitting was simply sitting, nothing more. That evening, inside the barracks, the air felt the same, thick and warm, the wooden walls unchanged, the same narrow benches lining the space, yet the room held a different kind of stillness, one that did not press down as heavily as before. Anna sat without thinking, without preparing, and for a brief moment she closed her eyes, not from exhaustion, but from the unfamiliar sense of rest that did not need to be managed. Across the room, another woman leaned back slightly against the wood, just a fraction, testing something new, then remained there, her breathing steady, her posture no longer rigid. No one acknowledged it, no one needed to. Outside, Carter walked his usual path, the gravel soft under his boots, the night air cooling slowly, and he did not look toward the barracks this time, not because he had forgotten, but because there was nothing left to confirm. Some things did not require recognition to be real, and some changes, once made, carried forward on their own, quiet and complete. By the third day, the change no longer felt new, it simply existed, woven quietly into the rhythm of the camp as if it had always been there, unnoticed by anyone who had not been watching closely enough to remember what came before. The morning moved with the same order, the same lines, the same silence, but the weight of it had shifted in a way that could not be measured in numbers or written into reports. Anna Weiss walked with the others, her step steady, her posture still composed, yet no longer held together by constant control, no longer shaped by anticipation of discomfort. The field stretched out under a pale sky, the air already warming, and the work began again without instruction, hands moving through familiar motions, bodies adjusting naturally to the demands of the day. when the midday break arrived, there was no hesitation, no pause before sitting, no shared glance of uncertainty, only a quiet, collective movement toward the benches as if something unspoken had already been agreed upon. Anna sat without thinking, her body lowering in one smooth motion, her hands resting lightly at her sides, and for a brief moment she noticed nothing at all, not the fabric beneath her, not the absence of resistance, only the simple fact that she was at rest. That was what had changed, not the presence of comfort, but the absence of awareness, the way her body no longer needed to monitor itself, no longer needed to prepare for something that would not come. Around her, the others showed the same quiet shift, one woman leaning slightly back for the first time, another adjusting her position without stopping halfway, small movements that would have gone unnoticed before, now carrying a different meaning. Across the yard, Corporal James Carter stood near the far fence, his attention divided between routine duties and the subtle changes that no one had asked him to observe, his expression unchanged, his posture steady, yet there was a stillness to him that suggested he was listening to something beyond sound, something that existed in the space between action and intention. He did not approach the benches, did not acknowledge the canvas, did not offer explanation or instruction, because none of it required words, none of it needed to be confirmed. The afternoon passed with the same steady rhythm, the heat rising and settling, the work continuing without interruption, but the difference revealed itself in the smallest details, in the way the women returned to the benches without hesitation, in the way they stood again without stiffness, in the way their movements no longer carried the same quiet resistance that had once defined them. Anna noticed it most in the moments when she forgot to notice, when sitting became something ordinary again, something that did not demand attention, something that did not require adjustment or control. That evening, inside the barracks, the air felt the same, warm and still, the wooden walls unchanged, yet the space held a different kind of quiet, one that did not press against her in the same way, one that allowed her to exist without constant awareness of her own posture. She sat without pause, without preparation, and remained there, still and balanced, her breathing even, her shoulders no longer held in tension. Across the room, another woman leaned back fully against the bench, not testing, not hesitating, simply resting, and no one reacted, because there was nothing left to question. Outside, Carter walked his usual path beneath a sky that had begun to darken, his steps measured, his presence quiet, and as he passed the barracks, he did not slow, did not look in, because the change no longer belonged to him, it had moved beyond that, settling into the space between people who would never speak of it, but would carry it forward in the simplest way possible, by no longer needing to stand when they could sit. The days continued to fold into one another, each one carrying the same structure, the same quiet discipline, but now holding something beneath it that no longer needed to announce itself. By the end of the week, the benches with their canvas coverings had become part of the landscape, no longer objects of attention, no longer something to question, just there, as natural as the fences, as ordinary as the dust that settled on them each afternoon. Anna Weiss no longer noticed the moment she sat, not consciously, not with the careful awareness that had once defined every movement, and that absence of notice was the clearest sign that something had changed, because before, every inch of motion had required attention, had demanded control, had carried consequence. Now, it passed without thought. The morning work stretched under a sky that promised heat long before it arrived, the air still cool enough to move easily, and the women moved with it, their rhythm steady, their silence unchanged, but their bodies no longer held in the same invisible tension. When the break came, they moved toward the benches without hesitation, and for a brief moment, as Anna lowered herself, she realized she had not prepared at all, had not measured the distance, had not adjusted her balance, and yet everything settled exactly as it should. She sat, and that was all. Across from her, another woman leaned back fully, resting her shoulders against the wood behind the canvas, her eyes closing for a second longer than usual, not from exhaustion, but from something closer to ease. No one reacted, no one needed to. The change had become shared, understood without language. Across the yard, Corporal James Carter stood near a stack of crates, speaking with a supply officer, his voice low, his posture relaxed, and when the conversation ended, he turned slightly, his gaze passing over the field, over the benches, over the quiet arrangement of people and objects that now carried a different meaning than before. He did not stop, he did not linger. The work resumed, the afternoon heat building slowly, pressing down in familiar waves. But the difference remained in the smallest places, in the way the women shifted positions without pause, in the way they returned to standing without stiffness, in the way their movements no longer carried the same guarded precision. Anna felt it most when she forgot to feel anything at all, when sitting was no longer an event, no longer something to endure, but simply a moment between tasks. That evening, as the sun lowered and the shadows stretched long across the yard, the women returned to the barracks with the same quiet order, their steps steady, their expressions unchanged, but their presence lighter in a way that could not be seen, only sensed. Inside, the benches waited as they always had, the canvas still in place, worn slightly now, edges soft from use, and Anna sat without pause, without hesitation, her body settling naturally, her breathing even, her shoulders relaxed in a way that would have been impossible before. Across the room, the others did the same, each finding their own stillness, their own balance, without needing to think about it. Outside, Carter walked past the barracks as he always did, his steps measured, his gaze forward, and for a brief moment, he slowed just slightly, not enough to be noticed, just enough to acknowledge something that did not require acknowledgement. Then he continued on, leaving behind a change that no one would write down, no one would speak of, but that would remain in the simplest of ways, in the quiet, unremarkable act of sitting without pain. The change did not announce itself, it simply continued, settling deeper into the rhythm of each passing day until it no longer felt like a change at all, but something that had always been there, waiting to be noticed. By now, the benches were used without thought, the canvas worn just enough to soften at the edges, carrying the quiet imprint of repetition, and the women moved through their routine with the same discipline, the same silence, but without the invisible weight that had once shaped every small decision. Anna Weiss no longer measured the distance between standing and sitting, no longer adjusted her balance before lowering herself, and in that absence of effort, something else began to emerge, something less about the body and more about the space around it. During the midday break, as the heat settled over the field in steady waves, she sat and allowed her shoulders to rest back for a moment longer than before, not testing, not questioning, simply remaining, her eyes drifting across the yard without focus, taking in the quiet arrangement of movement and stillness that defined the camp. Across from her, another woman rested her hands loosely at her sides, her posture no longer fixed, her breathing slow and even, and for a brief moment, the group appeared less like prisoners bound by routine and more like individuals occupying the same space, each holding their own stillness without tension. No one spoke, the silence remained, but it had softened, no longer shaped by caution, no longer held together by restraint. Across the yard, Corporal James Carter stood near the edge of the fence, speaking with a superior officer, his tone measured, his posture unchanged, and when the officer handed him a clipboard, he took it without comment. Glancing briefly at the page before lowering it again, the words were familiar, structured, complete in their own way, but they did not reflect what he now understood to be true. He closed the clipboard and returned it without adding anything, without correcting anything, because there was nothing in that language that could hold what had shifted. The afternoon passed as it always did, the work steady, the heat persistent, but the difference showed itself in the smallest, most ordinary ways. In the way the women returned to the benches without hesitation, in the way they stood again without stiffness, in the way their movements no longer carried the same quiet resistance that had once defined them. Anna noticed it most in the moments when she forgot the past entirely, when sitting required no memory, no comparison, no awareness of what had come before, only the present moment, simple and complete. That evening, as the sun lowered and the sky softened into shades of fading light, the women returned to the barracks, their steps steady, their formation unchanged, but their presence quieter in a different way, not guarded, not restrained, simply calm. Inside, the benches waited as they always had, the canvas still in place, now part of the room itself, and Anna sat without pause, without preparation, her body settling naturally, her breathing even, her hands resting lightly as if they had always known how to be still. Across the room, the others did the same, each finding their own balance without effort, without thought. Outside, Carter walked past the barracks as he always did, his steps measured, his gaze forward, and for a brief moment, he glanced toward the door, not to check, not to confirm, but simply to acknowledge something that no longer needed his attention. Then he continued on, leaving the quiet behind him, knowing it would remain, not because it was maintained, but because it had already become part of something larger than any single action could explain. By the following week, the pattern had settled so completely that it no longer felt like something new, but something that had quietly rewritten the rules of the place without asking permission, without leaving evidence behind. The benches stood where they always had, the canvas now softened by use, edges worn just enough to show time passing, and the women moved toward them with a natural ease that would have seemed impossible only days before. Anna Weiss no longer noticed the moment of sitting at all, not as an action, not as a decision, but as something that happened between one breath and the next, her body lowering without resistance, her shoulders releasing without thought, her hands resting lightly as if they had always known where to go. The absence of discomfort had created space, and in that space, something quieter began to take shape, something that did not belong to routine or discipline, but to the simple experience of being still without effort, across the bench. From her, another woman shifted slightly, stretching her back against the wood, her eyes closing for a second longer than necessary, not from exhaustion, but from the unfamiliar feeling of rest that did not need to be earned. No one reacted, no one needed to. The silence that filled the space had changed again, becoming less about what was withheld and more about what no longer needed to be said. Across the yard, Corporal James Carter stood near the administrative building, a clipboard once again in his hand, the same structured lines of information waiting to be reviewed, but this time he did not read it immediately, instead letting it rest at his side as his gaze moved across the field, taking in the quiet arrangement of people and objects that now carried a different meaning. When he finally looked down at the page, his eyes moved over the words without stopping, without marking anything, because there was nothing there that could capture what had shifted, nothing in the language of reports that could describe the absence of something that had once been constant. He closed the clipboard and set it aside without adding a single line. The afternoon passed in its usual rhythm, the heat rising and settling, the work continuing without interruption, but the difference remained in the smallest details, in the way the women returned to the benches without hesitation, in the way they remained seated a fraction longer, in the way their bodies no longer carried the same quiet tension that had once shaped every movement. Anna felt it most in the moments when she forgot entirely, when sitting became nothing more than a pause, when her body existed without needing to account for itself. That evening, as the sky softened into fading light and the camp returned to its quieter rhythm, the women moved back into the barracks, their steps steady, their formation unchanged, but their presence lighter in a way that could not be seen directly. Inside, the benches waited as they always had, the canvas still in place, now part of the room itself, and Anna sat without pause, without preparation, her body settling naturally, her breathing even, her shoulders relaxed in a way that had once required effort. Across the room, others did the same, each finding their own stillness without thought. Outside, Carter walked his usual path beneath the darkening sky, his steps measured, his presence quiet, and as he passed the barracks, he did not slow, did not look in, because whatever had changed inside no longer needed to be observed. It had already become part of something enduring, something that would remain long after the moment that created it had passed, carried forward in the simplest way possible, in the quiet certainty that some forms of dignity do not arrive with words, but with the absence of pain. By the time another week began, the change had settled into something quieter than habit, something that no longer needed to be reinforced because it had already become part of how the place functioned, unseen but present in every small movement. The mornings arrived the same way, light stretching across the yard, lines forming without instruction, boots pressing into dry ground with steady rhythm. And yet the atmosphere carried a difference that could not be traced to any single action, only to the absence of something that had once shaped everything. Anna Weiss moved with the others, her posture still composed, her expression unchanged, but her body no longer held in readiness for discomfort, no longer anticipating something that no longer existed. When the break came, she sat without thought, her motion continuous, her shoulders settling naturally, and for a moment she remained still, not because she had to be, but because there was nothing pushing her to move again. Across from her, another woman rested her back fully against the bench, her head tilting slightly as her eyes closed, not in exhaustion, but in a kind of quiet permission that had taken time to arrive. No one spoke, the silence remained, but it had transformed into something that held space rather than constrained it. Across the yard, Corporal James Carter stood near the far fence, His attention on the routine tasks that filled his day, but his movements carried the same quiet restraint that had defined them from the beginning, never drawing attention, never seeking acknowledgement. A younger soldier approached him briefly, speaking in low tones, gesturing toward the supply shed, and Carter listened without interruption, nodding once before responding with a few simple words that carried no emphasis, no explanation, only direction. When the soldier left, Carter remained where he was, his gaze moving across the yard for a moment longer than necessary, taking in the arrangement of people and objects that now held a different meaning than before, the benches, the canvas, the quiet posture of the women, all of it unchanged in form, yet altered in purpose. He did not approach, did not check, did not confirm, because there was nothing left to verify. The change had moved beyond the moment that created it, beyond the need for observation, existing now in the smallest details, in the way the women returned to the benches without hesitation, in the way they remained seated without tension, in the way their bodies no longer carried the same quiet resistance that had once defined them. Anna noticed it most in the absence of memory, in the way she no longer compared the present to what had come before, no longer measured comfort against discomfort, but simply existed within the moment itself. That evening, inside the barracks, the air remained warm, the wooden walls unchanged, the benches in their familiar places, yet the space felt different in a way that could not be described, only experienced. Anna sat without pause, her body settling naturally, her breathing even, her shoulders relaxed, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to remain completely still, not as an act of control, but as a simple state of being. Across the room, others did the same, each finding their own stillness without effort, without thought. Outside, Carter walked his usual path beneath a sky that had begun to darken, his steps measured, his presence quiet, and as he passed the barracks, he did not slow, did not look in, because whatever had changed inside no longer required his attention. It had already become part of something lasting, something that would continue without him, carried forward not in words or records, but in the quiet certainty that some changes do not need to be seen to endure. The days no longer felt like a sequence of events but like a single continuous moment stretched across time, each morning folding quietly into the next, each evening settling without resistance, and within that flow, the small change that had once stood out had dissolved into something deeper, something that no longer needed to be noticed to exist. Anna Weiss woke before the others, not from discomfort, not from habit, but from a stillness that had replaced both, and she remained seated for a moment on the edge of the bench, her hands resting lightly, her posture relaxed in a way that would have been unthinkable before, her body no longer negotiating with itself, no longer preparing for something that would not come. Around her, the barracks held its quiet, the same wooden walls, the same narrow spaces, yet the air felt different, not lighter, not cooler, but less demanding, as if it no longer pressed against the people inside it in the same way. When the others began to move, rising without hesitation, stepping into the routine of the day, the difference showed itself not in what they did, but in how little they needed to think about doing it. Outside, the yard stretched under a sky that had already begun to warm, the same fences, the same lines, the same order, and yet the rhythm carried something steadier, something that did not tighten at the edges. When the midday break arrived, the benches waited as they always had, the canvas now worn into place, no longer separate from the wood beneath it, and the women moved toward them without pause, without hesitation, their bodies lowering in one continuous motion, no adjustment, no calculation, and when they settled, they remained, not bracing, not preparing to rise again, simply present. Anna sat and allowed her shoulders to rest fully, her breathing even, her eyes drifting for a moment before returning to the quiet space in front of her, and in that moment, she realized she had not thought about sitting for days, had not measured it, had not compared it to what had come before, and that absence of thought felt more significant than the change itself. Across the yard, Corporal James Carter stood near the administrative building, speaking briefly with another officer, his tone even, his posture unchanged, and when the conversation ended, he walked past the benches without looking directly at them. Not out of indifference, but because there was nothing left to confirm, nothing left to adjust. The work resumed, the afternoon unfolding in its usual pattern, the heat rising and settling, the rhythm steady, uninterrupted, and yet the difference remained in the smallest places, in the way the women returned to the benches without hesitation, in the way they remained seated without tension, In the way their bodies no longer carried the quiet resistance that had once defined every movement. That evening, as the light faded and the barracks filled again with the same quiet presence, Anna sat without pause, her body settling naturally, her hands resting lightly, her shoulders relaxed, and for a brief moment she closed her eyes, not from exhaustion, not from habit, but from a simple awareness that nothing required her attention. Across the room, the others did the same, each finding their own stillness without effort, without thought, and the silence that filled the space no longer held anything back, it simply existed, complete in itself. Outside, Carter walked his usual path beneath the darkening sky, his steps measured, his presence quiet, and as he passed the barracks, he did not slow, did not look in, because whatever had changed inside had already moved beyond him, beyond the moment that created it, becoming something that would remain long after the details were forgotten, carried forward in the quiet certainty that sometimes the most lasting changes are the ones that leave nothing behind except the absence of what once was. Nothing about the place looked different, not to someone arriving for the first time, not to someone reading the reports, not to anyone who measured change in numbers or outcomes, because everything remained where it had always been, the fences standing in straight lines, the barracks unchanged, the benches aligned in their usual order, the canvas worn just enough to blend into the wood beneath it, and yet, for those who had been there before, for those who had learned to sit without sitting, to rest without resting, the difference was no longer something that could be ignored. Anna Weiss did not think about it anymore, not in the way she once had, not as something separate from the day, but as part of the quiet structure that held everything together. She moved through the morning with the same steady rhythm, her posture composed, her expression unchanged, but her body no longer carried the memory of resistance, no longer prepared itself for something that would not come. When the break arrived, she sat without hesitation, her movement continuous, her shoulders settling naturally, and for a moment she allowed herself to remain completely still, not because she had to be, but because nothing interrupted that stillness anymore. Across from her, another woman rested back fully, her eyes closing for a brief second, her breathing slow, and no one reacted, because there was nothing unusual about it now. The silence that filled the space was no longer shaped by caution, no longer defined by what was withheld, but by what had quietly returned, something closer to normal, something closer to what had existed before everything had changed. Across the yard, Corporal James Carter stood near the edge of the fence, his posture unchanged, his attention on the routine that continued without pause. And when a superior officer approached him with a clipboard, asking a brief question about conditions, Carter answered simply, his voice even, his words measured, offering nothing more than what was required. The officer nodded, wrote something down, and moved on, satisfied with what could be recorded, satisfied with what fit within the lines. Carter remained where he was for a moment longer, his gaze moving across the yard, not searching, not checking, simply observing what no longer needed observation. The afternoon passed as it always did, the heat rising and settling, the work continuing in steady rhythm, but the difference remained in the smallest details, in the way the women returned to the benches without hesitation, in the way they remained seated without tension, in the way their bodies no longer carried the same quiet resistance that had once defined them. Anna noticed it only in its absence, in the way she no longer noticed anything at all, in the way sitting had become something ordinary again, something that did not require thought, did not require adjustment, did not require endurance. That evening, as the light faded and the barracks filled with the same quiet presence, she sat without pause, her body settling naturally, her breathing even, her hands resting lightly, and for a moment she remained there, completely still, not aware of comfort, not aware of change, only aware of the absence of something that had once been constant. Outside, Carter walked his usual path beneath the darkening sky, his steps measured, his presence quiet, and as he passed the barracks, he did not slow, did not look in, because whatever had changed inside had already moved beyond him, beyond the moment that created it, beyond the need for acknowledgement. It remained in the simplest possible way, in the quiet certainty that dignity does not always arrive with recognition, and that sometimes the most meaningful change is the one that allows a person to sit without thinking about it at all.